So often when we think about culture, we look outwardly. We try to understand and figure out others' cultural practices and beliefs. And although this can be important, another crucial part of intercultural communication is to look introspectively at our own assumptions, values, and norms. And as global integration and immigration continue to increase at an exponential rate, never has there been a more important time to focus on our relationships and our communication in intercultural spaces. Over the next few minutes, I will describe some techniques for enacting an introspective approach to culture. This is an approach in which we continually and critically question our assumptions and work to deconstruct the stereotypes which we might have. So, over the past 40 years or so, there's been this large number of industries that have come up with these cultural competency programs in response to rapid globalization. Many of these programs are designed to make practitioners more competent in their knowledge of others' cultural practices and beliefs, such as appropriate hand gestures and personal space boundaries. However, in recent years, scholars and practitioners have begun to notice the shortcomings of such approaches. For instance, in one training that tried to train medical practitioners about Latino culture, it was found that Latino patients received less pain medication than other patients with similar ailments, based on the assumption that their pain was over-exaggerated. And so, in response to these cultural competency trainings, authors and researchers Melanie Terlevan and Jean-Marie Garcia contend that instead of learning some fixed body of cultural know-how, we need to enact cultural humility, these processes of ongoing self-reflection. And so, building on the notion of cultural humility, the first strategy for working introspectively involves working with others and coming over our cultural know-how, going beyond our cultural know-how. And so, in order to do that, first we must resist the urge to essentialize and generalize culture. Post-colonial writer Garriott Spivak terms essentializing as the process through which we reduce a culture down to a select number of traits. We've all done that, right? I mean, at some point in time. So, for instance, you might think about French culture, and you might think about sitting in a cafe in the middle of the day and drinking a glass of wine and smoking a cigarette. But is that all there is to French culture? And if the culture is not our own, we're predisposed to use stereotypes about those cultures to inform ourselves about it. And sometimes that can lead us into making some crazy assumptions. The other thing is, with essentializing, so reducing down, we also generalize. We lump people together from particular places, and we expect them to conform to our stereotypes. And so ponder for a minute. We're all here in the United States of America. If someone were to ask us, what is American culture? Can you define that for me? We would likely provide a variety of responses based on our own personal experiences here in the United States. Stereotypes would also likely inform our different orientations and ideas about cultural practices in the United States. So an example that highlights this is one time I was teaching a English culture class, English ESL and culture class to a group of refugees. And we came on the topic of sports, and at that time, the Cleveland Cavaliers were in the National Basketball Association finals. And some of the members of the class were really curious about this. They started hearing, there was big hype around the Cleveland Cavs, and they said, you know, hey, how's this game work? I can only name LeBron James, you know? And I know absolutely nothing about basketball. I'm like, can you pick it up and like throw it in the air? I have no idea. So to their dismay, I had no idea about these things. And something that really stuck with me is when one of my students said to me, he said, but Daniel, aren't you American? And from there, the class began to question whether or not I was Swedish. So they thought that, and it wasn't quite true. And so although this instance is humorous and lighthearted, the problem is that sometimes these assumptions can be very presumptuous and fraught with racist notions, and we don't know that we're doing it. And so we need to think about that. And so surely we're all going to generalize and essentialize. This is inevitable. And so this introspective approach to culture that I'm talking about tells us that we don't need to adhere to some pristine cultural morality in which we no longer generalize. That's not going to happen. But rather, such an approach asks us to continuously question our assumptions and look introspectively at the ways in which our personal experiences and our personal knowledge can create and perpetuate stereotypes. And so this leads into the second fundamental strategy to this introspective approach. And it's called reflexivity. And reflexivity goes beyond evading stereotypes and prompts us to reflect and think during our cultural interactions and after. And so on one level, reflexivity is enacted in fleeting moments where we just take a moment to stop and pause. And we don't do that often enough. But then on another level, we can practice reflexivity before and after interactions in intercultural spaces. And we can do this through jotting down notes, just musing for a while, journaling, talking with a friend about our experiences. And so when we're doing this, we need to silence the assumption-making demons in our head. The other important part is we need to ask our questions more humbly. And whoever said there are no bad questions, they were very, very wrong. I'm under the belief that they were. And so, for instance, professor of history and political science, Curtis Keem, he notes that when Americans meet people from Africa, oftentimes the very first question they ask is, "What tribe are you from?" And so Curtis Keem goes on to point out the ways in which this can be really offensive and loaded with assumptions. First, Africa is an incredibly diverse continent. It's huge. And to describe the social and political structures in that continent and reduce it down to just tribe is completely incorrect. And then the other part is sometimes we think about tribe and it's associated with primitiveness, and it perpetuates fallacious stereotypes of Africa as savage or backwards. And this is not true. And so although these kind of questions are formed with curious intentions, it's very fun to learn about where other people are from. We all want to do that, right? That's what's fun about living in an intercultural world. But what we need to do is we need to look more introspectively at how our assumptions can hinder us and the way that we can add those assumptions into our intercultural communication. And so the next thing is we need to get rid of this learned cultural expertise. In this day and age, we like to learn about culture, and I do it all the time. I'm so guilty of it all the time, and I notice myself thinking I'm the expert, and people will ask me, they'll say, "Oh, you've been to Africa? Tell me about what they do in Africa." And I'm like, well, I don't really know, because I've been to 5 cities, And so when we're thinking about this, when we're relinquishing ourselves of expertise, we need to go beyond what we read on the internet. So I have this story, is when I went to Morocco, and before I went on the internet to learn about the taboos and culturally appropriate customs of Morocco. And in many ways, this served me well. I learned that you eat with your right hand, and you put your hand on your heart to say, "Nice to meet you." And these things were really helpful because people were very happy that I took the time to learn. But sometimes it sent me astray. And so an instance of this is, in Morocco, dogs, I read on the internet, on this website, should never be in the house. They're considered dirty. They are considered dangerous. You shouldn't go and touch a dog on the street. This is just a bad, bad thing to do. So I was like, all right, I see a dog, I'm not touching it. Get out of there. And there's a lot of stray dogs. And so one day my friend invited me to his home for dinner. And he's like, all right, come over to my house, Daniel. We'd love to have you. I want to introduce you to my father. And I walk into the house, and the first thing I see is my friend's father sitting on the couch with this tiny little dog on his lap. And he's petting it, and I think the dog, I forget what the dog's name was, but I go up to him, and with curious intention, I go up and I say, hello, and I say, why do you have a dog in your house? Isn't that taboo in Morocco? To which he responded, for some people, yes, but for me, I really like my dog. So I go to my friend's house for dinner, and the first question, I don't even say, how are you? I just say to him, isn't that taboo in Morocco? Based on something that I had read on the internet. And so, although this wasn't super detrimental to the relationship, sometimes when we impose our assumptions and put them into our questions, they can. And so, through practicing reflexivity, this really crucial part of an introspective approach, we can take the time to make pauses in our communication and think, just think, is there an assumption in there? And then, so an introspective approach can be drastically helpful in improving our relationships in intercultural spaces. And now, more than ever, in a social and political climate that demonizes refugees and immigrants, we need to look inside of ourselves for ways to support and welcome people from diverse cultural backgrounds. And ultimately, an introspective approach, looking inside of ourselves, asks us to focus less on culture and more on individuals as human beings. Thank you so much.